Luisa worked at one of the best hospitals in the city. She was a surgeon, and that was her dream. Her mother did not like her daughter's choice to spend her life digging into human bodies, but saving lives was a beautiful mission. Luisa was a fragile and calm girl. She could have been a neurologist, an ophthalmologist, a therapist, but she firmly said, "No, I want to operate on people." During her time at the hospital, she showed her best side, and the management had already entrusted her with complicated surgeries. Frequently, they even called her on weekends and holidays. "Dear, if you continue dedicating all your time to work, you'll never get married." "Mom, marriage is not the main goal in life," Luisa responded. "Are you crazy? You're a woman and you know women age faster, time passes, the clock is ticking," her mother said. "Then let the clock take me," Luisa replied with indifference. The last time she was in a relationship was in college. She was in love with a classmate, but he betrayed her with her best friend. Since then, Luisa had distanced herself from her friends and kept away from them, so she wouldn't have to endure all that pain again. But she was beautiful, with blonde curls, porcelain white skin, and brown eyes. She was like a doll, but this doll had a steel character. Her profession was taking its toll. That night, Luisa had already left the hospital. It was a long day, 2 surgeries scheduled in the morning, and then she operated on a man after a car accident for several hours. Now his life was no longer in danger, but she was exhausted. She walked along the sidewalk of the hospital park and longed to go to her and her mother's apartment, take off her boots and coat, and head straight to the bathtub. There, she would spend an entire hour in the snow-white tub in a blackberry foam bath. Then, she would go to bed and fall into a sweet sleep. Suddenly, she heard a heavy moan. Luisa stopped and looked around, perplexed. It was getting dark and freezing that night. Luisa shivered from the cold and looked towards the nearby bushes. It seemed like that's where the moans were coming from. "Who's there?" she asked in a loud and bold voice. She walked towards the large bush, turning on her cell phone flashlight. The next second, she saw a man lying in the bush. He was writhing in pain, gasping, trying to say something, but all that came out of his throat was a moan. Luisa approached, saw the man, and stepped back. It was a homeless man dressed in some rags. He was of certain age, with very long and dirty hair, and a grizzled beard. The smell confirmed it once again. This was a man who had hit rock bottom in society. "Maybe he's drunk," she found herself thinking hesitantly, but immediately realized she was trying to find a reason not to get closer. She immediately felt ashamed. After all, she was a doctor, and it was clear he needed medical help. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need some help?" she asked and sat down next to the homeless man. He looked at her with eyes full of pain and despair and just moaned again, holding his stomach. "I'm a doctor, let me examine you," Luisa said softly, touching the poor man with her hand. The calm voice and kindness he had long forgotten made him freeze. Luisa placed a hand on his abdomen, pressed a few times and immediately said, "He needs urgent help." Luisa dialed the hospital's emergency number and called for doctors, a patient in the park. The receptionist was surprised and then said, "But you need to call a free municipal hospital ambulance. Our hospital does not accept this patient, it's an expensive and decent hospital." "No time," Luisa said, "the man needs urgent surgery, he may not make it to another hospital. Send an ambulance here now." The receptionist couldn't disobey the surgeon's commanding voice, and soon the doctors were running down the park path with the stretcher. When they saw the man, they were confused. "Luisa, are you sure about bringing him to our hospital?" questioned one of them. "Are you suggesting we leave him here?" she said indignantly. "But he is a vagrant, and we work in an expensive hospital," the paramedic argued. "First and foremost, he is a human being. Carry him carefully and set him on a stretcher." The paramedics just shrugged and did as the doctor told them. Everyone in the emergency room was also in shock. The nurses went pale, even the janitors were shocked, and Carlos, the on-call doctor, said he would not perform the surgery. "I won't go near that vagrant," he said. "I can do it alone," Luisa smiled and commanded the nurses. "Okay, ladies, the municipal hospital will take care of the vagrant soon," Carlos said. "And where will you take him to? Another hospital?" she asked. "They take everyone like him there," said the man. "But it's more than an hour away, and he will obviously worsen on such a trip in this condition. He might die on the way," Luisa said with a cold look. "So you think we should treat every vagrant, Luisa? You're in a class hospital, where rich people and even millionaires come. He's dirty, he smells, he might have some infection," said the on-call doctor, indignant. "Proper cleaning of the operating room solves all the problems," Luisa replied and rolled the vagrant into a room on a stretcher. The nurses hesitated for a while but followed Luisa. They knew she was right. But what would the chief doctor say about this? Mr. Eduardo had already left, but he would find out later anyway. "Ladies, I'll take full responsibility," Luisa said, seeing the doubt in the nurse's eyes. "Hurry up, wash him, and head to the operating room to prepare everything." The old anesthetist, Mr. Raul, didn't say a word. He was a man of old habits, as were everyone in the operating room. He appreciated Luisa's attitude and tried not to think of the chief doctor's reaction, but did not doubt that for Mr. Eduardo, the chief doctor would make a scandal. The operation was successful, though with difficulties. "Luisa, you made the right decision. If he had been sent to another hospital, he would have been dead by now," Mr. Raul said to her. "Yes, that's exactly what I've been trying to tell everyone," Luisa nodded. "But be ready for a reprimand from Eduardo," the anesthetist warned. "But why? Isn't Mr. Eduardo a human being?" "I think he will understand," she said. "He's a businessman first and foremost. I mean, who's going to pay for this operation? He doesn't even have an ID," Mr. Raul reminded her. "Well, he'll stay in our hospital for just a few days, and then we'll transfer him to the municipal hospital." She was very naive, but Luisa was sure the chief doctor would understand her. She returned home only after midnight. She had already forgotten about the bath. She just quickly washed her face, went to bed, and collapsed on the pillow, falling into a deep sleep. In the morning, a telephone call woke her up. It was the chief doctor of the hospital. He was yelling over the phone that Luisa caused unsanitary conditions and violated regulations. "What should I do now? Put the hospital under quarantine?" Mr. Eduardo shouted. "Why? I mean, we did all the tests, we even did a chest x-ray on the man. There's nothing wrong with him, he's healthy, Mr. Eduardo. He would have died if we hadn't operated," Luisa responded calmly. "But why do you care? Is he your father, brother, husband, or friend? That vagrant is long dead to society, such a man has no place in the world," said the chief doctor. "Mr. Eduardo, sorry, but your reasoning is not that of a doctor," Luisa dared to say. "You dare to talk to the chief doctor like this?" he yelled. "You are fired. We will send you the dismissal papers, and you can forget about the salary and your labor rights, for they will cover the hospital's losses." "What kind of losses?" Her hands trembled. Then the chief doctor ended the call. Luisa was out of sorts after the conversation. She didn't even notice the tears streaming from her eyes. She just stood at the window and the tears rolled down her face. "Dear, are you crying?" Her mother slowly approached her. "Who were you talking to?" "It was the chief doctor," Luisa said, wiping away the tears. "Mom, I've been fired." Then, she told the whole story. Her mother listened and just shook her head. "Oh my God, what a difficult time we are living in. Does he think you did the wrong thing?" the woman wondered. "Mom, all that matters to people like Mr. Eduardo is status and money. Human life has no value for him." Louisa, it's okay, dear, don't worry. You did the right thing. I'm sure someone in heaven is watching everything that is happening. Everything will come back to you tenfold, her mother hugged Louisa. I hope so, but I am unemployed now. How are we going to survive? I'll look for a new job, but I think Mr. Eduardo will ensure that I am blacklisted by hospitals. In that case, I won't be able to get a job in any hospital. Well, anyway, you could be a pharmacist. I mean, they make good money, her mother said. Mom, only surgery. I'm used to saving people, not selling medicines. But maybe you're right. Well, we'll see. Meanwhile, Mr. Eduardo was already calling other hospitals and telling chief doctors not to hire Louisa under any circumstances. Then, there was a knock on his office door. A worried assistant entered. Mr. Eduardo, we have an inspection today, his secretary said nervously. I just received a call from my friend. She is a secretary at the Ministry of Health. She warned me that they were coming for an unscheduled inspection. I can't believe it, shouted Mr. Eduardo. This is the last thing I need. Have they removed that vagrant? No, we're waiting for an ambulance, the assistant replied. When will it arrive? The man was angry. He dialed the phone number of the head of the therapeutic department, yelled, and ordered them to remove the homeless man from the hospital. I don't care if you throw him under a bush. A Ministry of Health inspection is on the way, and I don't want a homeless man here, unregistered, not fully examined, without ID. Let the municipal hospital ambulance take him from there. The chief doctor shouted, but it's cold outside, it's autumn, he responded. It's not winter yet, you can cover him with a blanket, advised the chief doctor. The nurses took a patient on a stretcher to the exit when people from the Ministry of Health appeared at the entrance. They had already passed by, but a man became interested and followed them. Where exactly were they taking the patient and where is the ambulance? Asked the inspector. It should have been here, replied Mr. Eduardo, smiling. We performed an emergency operation on the patient, it was successful, and now we're transferring him to another hospital for treatment. The man from the Ministry of Health reacted and looked out the window. He saw that the ambulance really had stopped. He passed by the patient but suddenly looked at the face and froze. Dad, the man exclaimed and ran to the stretcher. It's you, everyone looked confused. His colleague walked over to the stretcher too. Miguel, you must be mistaken, then he looked at the man and gasped. Mr. Antonio, is that you? The homeless man on the stretcher just looked at them confused but kept his eyes on Miguel. They knew each other. However, something had happened that left him confused, and now he couldn't remember where he knew the young man from. But the man called him Dad, so this is his son. Dad, do you recognize me? Miguel looked at the familiar facial features and couldn't believe that the father they had been searching for the last 2 years, having lost hope of finding alive, was lying in front of him on a stretcher. He was skinny, with a beard and hair grown almost to his shoulders. It happened more than a year ago. Mr. Antonio had just celebrated his 60th birthday as a retiree. He owned a large medical equipment business and wanted his son to leave his position at the Ministry of Health and join the trade, but Miguel was stubborn, saying that he liked his work and that business wasn't for him. This saddened Mr. Antonio very much. Who would manage the business then? He had a slightly older stepson, but Pedro was frivolous, he would ruin it very quickly. However, there was no choice. Mr. Antonio signed a power of attorney for him and began gradually teaching his stepson the essentials. Then, Mr. Antonio was attacked. He was driving his car and was cut off by another car. Some thugs got out of the car and hit his head. He only remembered falling into the river with the car. He managed to get out of the sinking car and then woke up on the beach. His head hurt and he could barely feel his arms and legs, and importantly, he remembered nothing. 2 homeless men were warming themselves near a fire on the beach, so Mr. Antonio went to them. They saw an old man with a bloody head and offered to help. They wanted to accompany him home, but he couldn't remember where to go. The homeless men didn't want to go to the police with him, so they just welcomed him into their company. That's how Mr. Antonio became a homeless man without memory and without a past. The police told Antonio's relatives they found the car in the river but not the body. However, there is a strong current in the river, so they might search for years and find nothing. Miguel didn't believe his father was dead and continued searching for him. Despite being in the same city, they always walked on different streets and never met. Pedro, the stepson, quickly assumed the role of the head of the company and began building the business his way. However, he managed it so that the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Miguel was furious because his brother almost bankrupted their father's business. How would they tell their father when he returned? People don't come back to life after death, Pedro smiled. But Mr. Antonio was back. Yes, it was
him on the stretcher. Miguel immediately ordered to take his father to the room and ensure he received the best care. No one would contradict him. The chief doctor was now giving orders on what to do and how to do it. Miguel had no idea where they wanted to take his father before. He had forgotten about it. He was worried about something else, how to recover his father's memory. It was clear he was suffering from amnesia. Would it be forever? But then he heard two nurses talking. He was standing in the ward, and the girls were talking in the hallway. We were sure he was a vagrant, one of them was saying. Mr. Eduardo is doing his best to please you now, but still he fired Luisa because she saved a human life. Exactly. I feel sorry for the girl. There are few doctors as talented as Luisa, then the other nurse replied. But injustices will always exist. So maybe we should tell the man from the Ministry of Health. He should know who saved his father and who ended up fired because of it, the nurse suggested to her colleague. Oh, no, Mr. Eduardo will punish us for that, she said. Then Miguel appeared from behind the door. Excuse me, girls, but I heard everything, he said bluntly. Tell me what really happened. The nurse was excited and nervous at first. However, Miguel could also fire them if he wanted. Out of fear, they did not keep the secret and told him that they found Miguel's father, how Luisa operated without listening to anyone's absurdities, and how the chief doctor yelled when he fired her. They also told him Mr. Eduardo wanted to throw the patient out on the street so that Ministry of Health inspectors would not see the homeless man without identity in the hospital. After listening to them, Miguel went to the chief doctor's office. The doctor was happy. The inspection would never occur. He could relax now, and the fact that the vagrant was the inspector's father, he thought was even beneficial for him. He was ready to tell how he saved an old man in his hospital. Yes, they wanted to transfer the patient to another hospital, but everything was within protocol. He didn't expect the staff to betray him, but everyone was tired of his arrogance and ill humor. You don't need to worry, Mr. Eduardo smiled when he saw Miguel at his office door. Your father is in one of the best hospitals. I'll ensure he receives the best treatment. I don't doubt it, he smiled awkwardly, sitting facing the chief doctor, looking into his eyes. Because now you know who his son is, but before that, you wanted to throw him on the street like a dog. Drifter, are you talking about? You're wrong, Mr. Eduardo said nervously. You also fired the girl who saved my father, continued Miguel. She wanted to quit, said the chief doctor. Liar. I know the truth. Now go to that girl and convince her to come here, Miguel said. Understood. The chief doctor nodded and ran out of the office, leaving Miguel alone. When Luisa saw the chief doctor at the threshold of her apartment, she was confused. Had he decided not to send the dismissal papers but bring the documents himself? Louisa, forget everything I said to you. I made a mistake. Sorry. Let's go to the hospital. The son of that old man you operated on is waiting for you there. Louisa, you did a great job. He turned out to be the father of one of the executives of the Ministry of Health. The executive's father? What was he doing on the street? She pondered. It's a complicated story. I think the police will deal with it now, said the man. Louisa hesitated, but she loved her job. She had to overcome her pride and went to the hospital with Mr. Eduardo. Miguel, seeing the young surgeon, was surprised. She is so young and wasn't afraid to go against the chief. That is very brave. Return to work. No one will fire you again. Mr. Eduardo realized his mistake, he said to the girl. The chief doctor nodded, embarrassed. Louisa could hardly contain her laughter, for it was the first time that Mr. Eduardo looked so pathetic. Several months passed, and Mr. Antonio was discharged. Louisa was working at the hospital, and everyone had forgotten about this incident. Then, the news spread throughout the city. The police discovered that Mr. Antonio's stepson, Pedro, was responsible for the attempt on his life. He had ordered the attack on his stepfather. He couldn't wait to take over his business, so he decided to expedite the process. Now, he is in prison. Mr. Antonio regained his memory, but did not return to business. Instead, a normal old age awaits him alongside his loving son. Later, Pedro got parole only because Miguel hired a good lawyer. His father asked him to do so. He didn't want his stepson to be imprisoned, as his life would be ruined there. After the trial, Pedro moved to another city and had no more contact with the family. How could he, said the chief doctor when he heard the details. How can a human being do something like that? His colleagues listened and just nodded, but then smiled. Mr. Eduardo was not someone who had the right to talk about honor and morality. Later, there was an inspection at the hospital. They discovered that the chief doctor had embezzled state money. All funds provided by the state for the hospital went into Mr. Eduardo's pocket. He was tried and ended up on parole too. Now, he no longer talks about honor and morality. He was suspended from the medical profession. Louisa still works as a surgeon, but now, after a workday, she is not rushing to her mother's house but to a date. Yes, she is dating Miguel, and they will soon be married. The man is a little older than Louisa, but that age difference means nothing, because love knows no bounds.